Some authors you love for their fire, some you love for their eyes. Hello, good evening, and welcome to a new episode of Arguably the Reading Quest. I am Nishant. So, the book I'm going to talk about today is Disgrace by Coetzee. It's the 25th year of the book, Disgrace, one of his most controversial one, his second Booker Prize awarded book, and the book that won him the Nobel Prize in Literature, rightly, in the year 2003. And this book was published in the year 1999, the year in which he has been awarded a Booker Prize for this book. So before we start, just let me, introduce you to a few quotes that will give you an idea that what to expect. When all else fails, philosophize, says Coetzee in this book, Disgrace. When all else fails, philosophize. This is one of my personal favorites. He continues to teach because it provides him with a livelihood. Also because it teaches him humility. Brings it home to him who he is in the world. The irony, though, does not escape him. That the one who comes to teach learns the keenest of the lessons. And the one who comes to learn nothing. He would not mind hearing Petrus' story one day. Petrus is one of the characters in the book. But preferably not reduced to English. More and more he is convinced that English is an unfit medium for the truth of South Africa. Stretches of English code, whole sentences, long have thickened, lost their articulations, their articulateness, their articulatedness. Like a dinosaur expiring and settling in the mud, the language has stiffened. Pressed into the mold of English, Petrus' story would become aesthetic, bygone. When did a sheep last die of old age? Sheep do not owe themselves, they do not owe their lives. They exist to be used, every last ounce of them. Their flesh to be eaten, their bones to be crushed and fed to poultry. Nothing escapes, except perhaps the gallbladder, which no one will eat. Descartes should have thought of that. The soul suspended in the dark, bitter gall hiding. And then the last one, this is again a very, very favorite, a personal favorite of mine. The end of roaming. What comes after the end of roaming? ? He sees himself, white hair, stooped, shuffling to the corner shop to buy his half-liter of milk and half loaf of bread. He sees himself sitting blankly at a desk in a room full of yellowing papers, waiting for the afternoon to peter out so that he can cook his evening meal and go to the bed. The life of a superannuated scholar without hope, without prospect. Is that what he is prepared to settle for? So, if I talk of, the spectrum of writing, at one end of the spectrum, there is a writer of the likes of D.H. Lawrence, whose prose is very stylistic, highly ornate, I'll say baroque, full of beautiful adjectives and adverbs and intensifiers. On the other end of the spectrum, in sharp contradistinction to D.H. Lawrence, there are writers like Coetzee. Very austere prose, devoid of any adjective, devoid of any adverb, short, pithy sentences, but intense to the core. So, Disgrace is a novel about a university professor, David Lurie, who was twice married, divorced, a middle-aged man who taught the poetry of the Romantics at, Cape Town, South Africa, at one of the colleges. There he happens to got entangled with one of his students who was of the age of her own daughter. And the story as it progresses, that, he end up getting physical with his student, and then starts the real story of Disgrace. So the story is plotted in such a way that you would not be able to figure it out, whether it was a forceful physical assault, whether it was a tacit consent, whether it was an ambiguous consent between the two. But so did it happen, and then his university life as a teacher ended there. And he was willing to admit his guilt, but he was not, willing to yield into pressure to repent it publicly. Then he left the university, and then he went to his daughter, who somehow was, living in some remote farm at some South African small village, and she was making a living there. There again, a different and a more brutal and violent form of rape happened with his own daughter in front of his own eyes by the blacks. And then he again, got entangled into a very different kind of human existence and suffering and misery. And he was trying to pull out his daughter of the relationship she has with the family, the villagers and the family members all around, but unable to do so. And this is how the story progresses. Disgrace is I'll say, a narrative to the heart of darkness. Now I will quote some of the critical acclaims and analysis from The Guardian, from The Conversation, from the New York Times, to give you a holistic perspective as to what to expect. So Disgrace, writes Will Forrester in The Guardian, won Coetzee a second booger, and arguably the novel for good reason. A novel between salvation and ruin, between the politically large and personally small, between moral bankruptcy and bailout. It is Coetzee, the prose stylist, at his finest. Coetzee, the literary philosopher, at his sharpest. Coetzee, the novelist, driven by capturing what Harold Pinter called the real truth of our lives and societies, and maybe getting the closest to finding it. Again, Andrew Willis writes in The Conversation that Disgrace is a novel that interrogates the transparency of language, more specifically English. Its protagonist, David Lurie, is an academic whose research interest is the poetry of the Romantics. He wonders at one point whether English is a fit medium for communication in post-apartheid South Africa. It appears tired, he reflects. So all of Coetzee's works are self-reincriminating interrogations. They addresses the complicity of writers in events that are too easily dismissed as beyond their capacity to influence. They examine privileges inherit at the expense of others in a way that remain profoundly important. Their honesty and power to discomfort makes them as necessary today as when they first appeared. And this is one of the finest introductions written by Jason Farrago at the New York Times. And I quote verbatim, that some authors you love for their fire, some you love for their ice. James Coetzee, the South African turned Australian novelist, has spent half a century engaged with the biggest question of human reason and human dignity. But his novels are not what you'd call grand. They're sleek. As you can see, it's less than 200 pages, quite a short booklet. Unadorned, unfailingly precise. Most top out at 200 pages or so. The sentences have been knapped to their sharpest. Stylistically, his novels are quite brisk. Morally, they are heavyweights. So again, as the story goes, that's the 50-something-old Professor David Lurie. A mastery of English Romantic poetry seems to offer an ethical exemption for seducing one of his students whose degree of consent we could generously call ambiguous. And the beauty of prose is that I have read it twice and thrice, that particular excerpt where all this, physical violence and sexual assault happened. I was unable to figure whether it was ambiguous, whether it was tacit, whether it was forced, and that is for you to read and find it out for yourselves. The affair is exposed. Lurie loses his job, and then a kind of dark comedy of Kafka in the university teaching room is set. He leaves Cape Town to join his daughter, who works on her farm in the Eastern Cape. But then comes another act of sexual violence. This time it is far more brutal and transgressive. As Lucy considers her well-being, her father must cleanse the gangrenous foundation of his moral life. Unlike his equivocal 1980 fiction, Disgrace demanded to be read in the light of contemporary South Africa, a new multiracial democracy engrossed in the public hearing of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. When David begs his daughter to go to police, Lucy insisted that she must not report her gang rape in this place at this time, this place being South Africa. I can't lie, this book is bleak, says the writer of this paragraph. But so is Oedipus' Risk. There can be a beauty in bleakness, and the austere fatalism of Disgrace has made it one of the most celebrated, debated, controversial novel in the past 25 years. And this novel also elicited angry opposition in South Africa from the top of the African National Congress, who decried its racism to the United Nations, and from the white conservatives who thought they were the real victim. Because, the professor's daughter, in this case, a white professor, was raped in front of her own, in front of his own eyes by a black. And black was at a lower level of social hierarchy than she was, actually. But today, though, it is more immediate value lies in the scrutiny of the gender. So Disgrace is, of course, as the writer says, a proto-Me Too novel, all about the desires and deficiencies of men and the public and the private cancellation they may bring upon. Disgrace also inaugurates a major theme of Coetzee's later writing, the relationship of human to animals, examined with a philosophical rigor in Elizabeth Costello, one of his sort of fiction, Elizabeth Costello. So, if Lurie is the name of the professor's daughter, so if Lurie finds even the slightest absolution or grace, the title is not quite the opposite. It is in a veterinary clinic caring for animals in a world where men's are dog. That is what Jason Farrago of New York Times, right? So I hope I have given you a glimpse of what to expect. This is the winner of 1999 Booker Prize, Nobel Prize winner in literature in the year 2003. I bought this novel somewhere around the year 2014 or something. And then I was quite, I was not motivated enough to read this novel because I was not very much into Booker Prize, and I thought that, okay, I was unaware of the reviews and I couldn't get any strong recommendation to read this novel. But a friend of mine, persuaded me, urged me to read this novel, that you should, Nishant, what you're doing, you should read this novel. And finally, when I read it, I was astounded. I mean, how can someone write, so clear-cut proses with stylistic austerity, devoid of any adjectives and adverb, pithy to the core, but very, very morally heavyweight, very intense, very dark, existential. So please read this novel and do tell me your opinion. Happy reading, guys. If you've still not liked, shared and subscribed my channel, Arguably the Reading Quest, please do that. Thank you so much.